Attention, attention, this is History Lost in Time. And welcome to the History Lost in Time podcast with another Navy episode. The topic of this episode. This time I will talk about the third class of battleships in Germany, the Wittelsbach-class. On my old YouTube channel I talked about them in episode 141. This episode is tied to the battleship episodes 19 and 23. Political agenda and background. None. The sources that were used. I will use the same sources as in episodes 19 and 23, so if you don't want to hear them being repeated, you can skip the next minute. For all others, these are the sources in short. Admiral Scheer, Deutschlands Hochseeflotte im Weltkrieg. Translation: Germany's High Seas Fleet during the World War, published by Verlag August Scherl, Berlin, probably 1919, date of the foreword. Ulrich Israel, Jürgen Gebauer, Panzerschiffe 1900, Translation: Ironclads around 1900, published by Brandenburgisches Verlagshaus, Berlin, 1998. Günter Kroschel, August Ludwig Evers, Die deutsche Flotte 1848 bis 1945, Translation: The German Fleet, 1848 to 1945, published by Verlag Lose Eising, Wilhelmshaven, 1962, third improved edition, 1964. Hans-Jürgen Hansen, Die Schiffe der deutschen Flotten 1848 bis 1945, Translation: The Ships of the German Fleets, 1848 to 1945. Published by Verlag Bechtermünz, licensed version for the Weltbild Verlag Augsburg, 1998. As usual, any gaps will be filled by Wikipedia. The predecessors of the Wittelsbach class, the battleships of the Kaiser Friedrich III class, were built from 1895 to 1901 and were all commissioned by 1902. A small reminder. Initially, the Navy wanted to build more battleships directly after the Brandenburg ships had been completed. However, due to problems with Reichstag, there was a delay of several years. Since 1897, Alfred von Tirpitz was State Secretary of the German Imperial Naval Office. He wanted to solve parliament problems like this permanently, so he drafted a naval bill. This bill defined the strength of the Navy as well as the life cycles of capital warships. That way, negotiations with the Reichstag would be avoided, since the Parliament would be forced to finance new ships and replacement ships automatically due to that bill. From the Navy's point of view, this was both elegant and easy, as the Navy could plan and work without investing time and energy into political negotiations. However, from the Parliament's point of view, this bill meant a reduction in influence. However, the first version of the bill was passed in 1898. In this first version, the bill said that the Navy should have a strength of 19 battleships, 8 coastal defense ships, 12 large cruisers, and 30 small cruisers. The goal was to reach this by 1903. The coastal defense ships did already exist. These were the Siegfried and Odin-class ships I discussed in episode 15. The Brandenburgs and the Kaiser Friedrich III ships made up 9 battleships, so the Navy needed a further 10. Even before all ships of the Kaiser Friedrich III class were completed, construction of the Wittelsbach-class ships was started. There were some discussions about updating the Kaiser Friedrich III design, but Tirpitz in particular saw value in having a large number of very similar ships, as they could be used as a unit. So the differences between the two classes were minor. The internal structure and the armor were slightly improved, but that was basically it. The Wittelsbach-class ships displaced 12,798 tons, so about 1,000 tons more than the Kaiser Friedrich III class. The dimensions were also very similar: length of 126.8 meters, width of 22.8 meters, and a draft of 7.95 meters. The triple expansion engines produced 14,000 horsepower, which allowed the ships a top speed of 18 knots, so basically around 1,000 horsepower and 0.5 knots more than the predecessors. The crew was slightly larger, with 33 officers and 650 sailors. The maximum range was 9,300 kilometers or 5,800 miles. The armament was identical: 2 double-gun turrets, so a total of 4 24-cm main battery guns, with 1 turret at the front and 1 at the back. The maximum range of 16.9 kilometers was not really important, as combat distances were still between 1 and 3 kilometers. However, the rate of fire of 3 shots per minute was very high and was considered to be quite important. The secondary battery consisted of 18 15-cm guns with a range of 13.7 kilometers and a rate of fire of 4 to 5 shots per minute. Then there were 12 88mm guns with a range of about 7 kilometers and a rate of fire of 10 to 15 shots per minute. For close encounters with torpedo boats, the ship could use 12 37mm guns with a range of 4 kilometers and a theoretical rate of fire of 300 shots per minute. Finally, the ship also had 6 45-cm torpedo launchers. The torpedoes were the same that were already used on the predecessors. They had 2 settings, a range of 800 meters at 26 knots or 500 meters at 32 knots. The armor consisted of modern Krupp steel. SMS Wittelsbach and SMS Schwaben were built by the Kaiserliche Werft shipyard in Wilhelmshaven. SMS Wettin was built by the Chichau shipyard in Danzig. The Germania Werft shipyard in Kiel took over the task of constructing SMS Zähringen, and SMS Mecklenburg was built at the Vulcan shipyard in Stettin. Construction for all ships started between September 1899 and September 1900, and the ships were commissioned between October 1902 and April 1904. SMS Schwaben was the last ship that was completed, and she was not used for the battleship fleet. Alfred von Tirpitz insisted that she was used for training purposes to replace the obsolete ironclad Friedrich Karl. However, all other ships became part of the battle fleet. By 1904, Germany had 14 battleships available. However, Alfred von Tirpitz insisted on changing the naval bill, so a second variant was passed by the Reichstag in 1900. The goal now was to have a fleet by 1920 with the following strength: 38 battleships, 14 large cruisers, 38 small cruisers, and 96 torpedo boats. So while the first version of the bill aimed for the creation of a second-class navy comparable to the navies of the United States of America, France, and Russia, the second variant of the bill aimed for the creation of a navy with a strength very close to the one first-class navy on the planet, Great Britain's Royal Navy. With this bill, the naval arms race between Germany and Britain did more or less officially start. So when the Wittelsbach ships were launched, the political situation in Europe had changed fundamentally. After the ships were launched, construction of their successors started, and design work on the successors of their successors started as well. Before taking a look at the careers of these ships, first let's take a look at the competition abroad. What was happening there? From 1898 to 1904, France built the battleship Suffren. With a displacement of 12,892 tons, it was fairly similar to the Wittelsbach ships. The dimensions were also very similar: length 125.9 meters, width 21.4 meters, draft 8.2 meters. The triple expansion engines produced 16,200 horsepower, which allowed the ship a top speed of 17 knots. The range was 5,715 kilometers or 3,551 miles. The crew had a strength of 668 men. The armament was very different though. The main armament consisted of 4 305mm guns in 2 turrets. However, while the guns had more punch, their rate of fire was lower. The secondary battery consisted of 10 164.7mm guns, 8 100mm guns, 22 47mm guns, 2 37mm guns, and 4 450mm torpedo launchers. At the same time, also between 1898 and 1904, Britain built 5 battleships of the London class. These displaced more and they were larger: 15,700 tons, length of 131.6 meters, width 22.9 meters, and draft 7.9 meters. Their triple expansion engines produced 15,000 horsepower, and the ships had a top speed of 18 knots. The crew had a strength of 714 men. The main armament also consisted of 4 305mm guns in 2 turrets. The effective firing range was 14 kilometers and the rate of fire was 1 shot per minute. The secondary battery consisted of 12 152mm guns, 16 12-pounder guns caliber 7.62 centimeters, 6 3-pounder guns caliber 47mm, and 4 457mm torpedo launchers. Overall, the Wittelsbach ships were able to keep up with the competition. The lower caliber was balanced out by the higher rate of fire. Firing ranges were not considered to be that important, which meant that the armor penetration of the guns at close ranges was sufficient. With few exceptions, the peacetime careers of the Wittelsbach ships were unspectacular. In 1908, SMS Mecklenburg suffered a serious water ingress due to a technical malfunction. The sinking of the ship was only prevented by sealing up the lateral torpedo launchers from the outside. During maneuvers at 1912, SMS Zähringen sank the torpedo boat G171 accidentally. From 1905 to 1908, SMS Wittelsbach was commanded by Graf von Spee, the namesake of the World War II-era German pocket battleship. When the HMS Dreadnought was commissioned in 1906, pre-dreadnoughts like the Wittelsbach ships were quickly forced into reserve roles by new designs. In the last years before World War I, the Wittelsbach ships were either part of the reserve fleet in the Baltic or decommissioned. However, when the war broke out in 1914, they were all reactivated and united within the 4th Battleship Squadron, but their wartime service only consisted of patrols without enemy contact, guard duties and support missions for more modern ships. They were present when the Navy unsuccessfully attempted to rescue the cruiser SMS Magdeburg. Since the newest Russian battleships of the Gunboat-class were far superior to them, and since their torpedo protection was insufficient, the Wittelsbach ships were used very reluctantly and cautiously. Just like all other older battleships, they were decommissioned in late 1915 and early 1916, and their crews were transferred to newer ships. From 1916 to 18, the ships were sometimes used for training, but mostly they served in harbors as depots, floating barracks and floating prisons. They were also partially disarmed, which did include the large main battery guns, and their weapons were transferred to the army to be used at the front lines. In 1919 and 20, SMS Wittelsbach, SMS Wettin and SMS Schwaben were used as mother ships for minesweepers in the North Sea and the Baltic Sea. They were then scrapped in 1921 and 22. SMS Mecklenburg had already been scrapped by 1921. The ship's bell of SMS Wettin is located at the Military Historical Museum of the German Armed Forces in Dresden. Only SMS Zähringen saw further use. She had already been partially disarmed during the war. 2 of her 15-centimeter guns were installed on the submarine cruiser U-155. She was supposed to serve as a training ship, and the conversion had started during the war but was never finished. After World War I, Germany was only allowed to keep a very limited number of warships. While most of the Wittelsbach ships alongside many other battleships had to be scrapped, the Zähringen survived. She was completely disarmed and remained as a hulk in Wilhelmshaven. From 1926 to 28, the German Navy converted her into a target ship. In the Kroschel-Evers book, you can see pictures of her before and after this conversion. Picture 72 shows Zähringen as a classic battleship, large gun turrets and a massive superstructure. Picture 334 shows Zähringen after the conversion. A fairly flat and barren ship with very little superstructure. In order to keep her afloat even when damaged, 1,700 tons of cork were installed. However, that turned out to be a mistake, since it easily caught fire. The crew now only consisted of 67 men, and the top speed was limited to 13.5 knots. The ship could be radio controlled by a small torpedo boat named Blitz. In 1928, Zähringen was recommissioned. During the ceremony, the battleship Elsass opened fire on her, and Reichspräsident Paul von Hindenburg was present to watch. Since 1928, Zähringen served with the German Navy of the Weimar Republic and the German Navy of the Third Reich. In 1933, she was used for the Heinz Rühmann movie Drei blaue Jungs, ein blondes Mädel. The ship was sunk on December 18, 1944, during a British air raid on Gotenhafen. As she had sunk in shallow waters, she was refloated and then sunk by the Germans on March 26, 1945, shortly before the arrival of the Red Army to block the harbor. The next day, the battleship Gneisenau was also sunk for the same purpose. Both ships were raised and scrapped between 1949 and 1951. A few finishing words. In the end, the Wittelsbach ships also had rather short and unspectacular service careers, just like their predecessors. It is quite telling that their most interesting missions included being minesweeper motherships and target ships after World War I, while the ships mostly remained inactive during the war. This is more or less exemplary for the tragic role of battleships, which caused so much tension before the war but didn't do much during the war. However, this is the last battleship class that saw this kind of career. The successors of the Wittelsbachs, the battleships of the Braunschweig-class, did see some active combat service during the war. However, more about them in a future episode. Thank you. This was History Lost in Time.